Who do you think you are to argue with the police? A scream of hatred ripped through the cold, empty air of the airport like a slap in the face to anyone who still believed in justice. Samantha Lewis, an elegant black woman dressed elegantly in a yellow suit, was just standing there waiting to board her plane with her first-class ticket. Suddenly, she became the target of a witch hunt due to the evil gaze of a white woman, Ava Hart, who, with an undisguised look of contempt, denounced her without any evidence. There was no explanation, no reason other than hatred. Ava stood in the back, her eyes full of discrimination and hostility directed at Samantha, who was just a regular passenger waiting to board her flight. The sight instantly froze the airport. Officer Jack Blake, an old policeman with a cold and stern face, walked towards Samantha. Beside him was Officer Chris Miller, a young man who seemed a little hesitant, looking at Samantha as if he was unsure of what he was about to do. Two policemen burst in, their faces cold, and handcuffed her as if she were a dangerous criminal. The station was packed with people, but everyone turned away, pretending not to see, letting Samantha be dragged away like discarded trash. No one spoke. No one intervened. At this moment, a tiny sound rang out from behind. Ella, a 7-year-old black girl, stood next to her mother, watching the whole scene. She looked up and asked her mother, "Mom, is she bad?" The question rang out in the quiet space like a wake-up call, questioning kindness, justice, and discrimination. Justice was crushed under the boot of blatant indifference and shameless racism. Samantha Lewis, her hands in handcuffs and her head held high, was not the type to accept defeat. Within hours, those who had despised her were on their knees, trembling, begging for forgiveness they did not deserve. But apologies mean nothing when dignity has been brutally trampled. Think you've seen injustice? This story will make you realize the truth is much more brutal. Samantha stood silently in the crowd, her dark eyes filled with confusion, as if everything around her had suddenly stopped. Time and space turned back to a dark and meaningless place. The flickering lights on the ceiling, the hurried footsteps on the tiled floor, all seemed to become a distant echo. The scene before her eyes, with its cold and indifferent faces, was no longer a normal life. She did not understand why she was dragged into such a situation. The first-class ticket in her hand was not recognized by anyone. No one cared. She was not a criminal, yet the feeling of bleeding from the contemptuous looks, from the whispers in the crowd, made her heart feel like it was being torn into pieces. As Officer Blake approached, his gaze was cold as a sharp sword, ready to cut off any last shred of hope she had left. He didn't need an explanation, didn't need to find out why, he simply carried out the order. With just one glance from Ava, the woman pointed at her as if she were a danger. Everything was decided. Samantha felt the humiliation in every step she took as she was dragged away. No one spoke. No one dared to stand up. An indifference so painful that it was hard to breathe. Every step she took was a step down a dead-end road, where everyone's eyes had turned away, leaving her like a nameless, worthless ghost. She could feel every look like a punch to her heart, every pain silently flowing inside her, but she had no right to fight back. She could feel the cold handcuffs tightening around her hands, a reminder that racism is never just words, it is also incredibly cruel actions. Ava stood there, her eyes filled with triumph. Everything in her eyes seemed preordained, as if she had known that Samantha would be the one to be defeated in this game. With a slight smile, her face full of contempt, Ava looked at Samantha as if she had accomplished some special mission. With each passing second, Samantha's humiliation deepened as Officer Blake's eyes, still cold as steel, followed her every step. Meanwhile, Officer Miller, who stood next to Blake, could not hide the hesitation in his eyes. It seemed that he knew, deep down, that what was happening was wrong. But the power of the system and the coercion of those in power kept him from speaking up. He looked at Samantha's handcuffed hands, guilt bursting inside him, but all that stopped was silence, as justice was drowned under the weight of prejudice and indifference. Samantha was not weak, even though her hands were cuffed, even though her heart was pounding with every step she was dragged, she still kept her gaze. She did not let herself bow. She did not allow this humiliation to take away her dignity. Even though the walls of injustice were crumbling down, she still stood there steadfastly, not a single cry, not a single act of resistance. She simply stood tall, proud, while the world around her was turning its back on her. But deep down, she knew that it was not her fault, but the world was teaching her a bitter lesson about indifference and prejudice. And the only thing she could do was to hold herself up, even though everyone around her turned their backs on her. As Officer Blake tightened the cuffs around Samantha's wrists, the air in the cabin froze. The sound of cold metal on metal was brutal, sharp and decisive, like a sentence that had been signed without any evidence. He didn't look her in the eye, didn't ask a single question, simply acted on the dictates of his prejudice and authority. There was a chilling familiarity in Blake's deadpan eyes, as if he had done this 100 times before, and didn't care if the woman before him was in pain. She wasn't a person to Blake, just an object to be subdued, an anomaly in the order he maintained. In contrast to that determination, Officer Miller stood still for a few seconds, clutching the radio at his side, as if to hold on to the fragile courage he had left. His eyes swept over Samantha's face. Her eyes were still wide, but no longer surprised, only muted tiredness, as if she had seen this scene too many times in her life to have the strength to resist. Miller swallowed, his throat tight with something he couldn't name. Maybe conscience, maybe shame at standing in the ranks of those who wore uniforms but forgot about justice. But he didn't move forward, didn't say anything, just stood there in the crowd that was slowly retreating, as if Samantha had brought some strange disease that they needed to avoid. And in that moment, Samantha understood, clearly, painfully, nakedly, that she had not been arrested for anything wrong. She had broken no laws, caused no disturbances, done nothing to deserve being handcuffed in public. The only thing that had made her a target was her presence, the color of her skin, the confidence she carried herself with, the first-class ticket that people like Ava had never thought someone like her could rightfully possess. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a blatant denial of the right to exist as an equal. And in that moment, the pain inside her came not from the handcuffs tightening around her wrists, but from the feeling of being rejected by a society that was built to protect people like her. The passengers around her, they didn't look at her. Some pretended to be busy with their phones. Some looked up at the ceiling as if searching for some light above to escape the scene before their eyes. No one spoke, not a word of inquiry, not a single look of sympathy. They didn't need to say anything, because their silence was enough to emphasize the boundary between us and you. In that silence there was fear, cowardice, and most of all, a deep-seated indifference, to the point that they didn't realize they were supporting a system that always disregarded the lives of people of other skin colors. Samantha stood there, between two officers, one as cold as ice, the other as shivering as grass in the wind, surrounded by a crowd that chose to look away. For a moment she felt less like she was on a business-class flight, and more like she was in a theater, silent as the audience watched a familiar scene. A black man publicly punished, and everyone else was silent because they knew the outcome but didn't want to be involved. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as her heart sank. She knew she wasn't the first to be in this situation, and she wouldn't be the last. But something was building in her wide eyes now. Not resentment, but a flame, small but persistent. A flame that wouldn't be extinguished by the scornful gaze, the steel cuffs, or the silent, terrified crowd. The fire of a man who knows he is innocent and knows he must stand up with everything he has. The cell was small, cold, and dark, as if designed to extinguish any remaining light in one's soul. Samantha sat there, her back against the cold gray wall, her hands still red from where her wrists had been cuffed. No one said anything to her. No explanation, no reason, no apology. She had simply been thrown in there like a piece of junk, a nuisance to be removed from the familiar order. But what choked Samantha was not the wall that surrounded her, but the memories that were still fresh. Every moment of public humiliation, Ava's triumphant gaze, Officer Blake's prejudiced frown, and the deafening silence of everyone who had turned away. She took a deep breath, the smell of metal and mold making her chest ache, as if every molecule of air reminded her of the place society had always assigned to people like her. Lower, smaller, and if possible silent. But in the heavy silence, Samantha did not cry. Not because she did not hurt, but because tears were a luxury for a woman of color who had learned to keep her pain inside since she was a little girl waiting for her mother to get off work at the bus stop in the harsh sunlight of the summers of poverty. Each image flashed through her mind like a slow-motion film. That morning, when she packed breakfast for her 7-year-old son, kissed his forehead, and gave him many instructions, because she knew that in an unfair world, children like her son were not allowed to make mistakes like other children. She remembered her mother, a woman who had worked for 30 years in a small hospital in the old town, silently wiping away the blood of patients, but never once got promoted just because she did not have the right face to meet customers. And Samantha remembered herself, at 22 years old, standing in front of the interview room at her first financial company, wearing a dress bought on installments, her heart trembling because she knew that just one look from the person opposite would be enough to slam the door of her career. Not because her profile was weak, but because they could not imagine someone like her could represent a luxury brand. And yet she kept going. She kept going through the suspicious looks, the ambiguous questions, and the seemingly kind but cautious advice like, "Are you sure you're right for this environment?" Samantha worked twice as hard, endured 3 times as much, and as she sat in her leather chair on the 17th floor of a glass building in the heart of the city, she knew she hadn't gotten there by luck. She had paid with her health, with the sacrifices of her family, and with the silent swallowing to hold on to a dream that society had never created for people like her. And now, all that hard work seemed to have been crushed in a matter of minutes. A first-class ticket, a reward for a project she had spent 9 months sweating over, had become the reason she was questioned, and handcuffed. She wasn't arrested for anything wrong. She was arrested because others couldn't believe that a woman of color could go to a place they thought was not meant for her. But Samantha refused to let the bitterness consume her. There was a light inside her, though empty from the shock, that had been nurtured by years of rejection and marginalization. She couldn't change the color of her skin, but she could change the way she lived. And she knew that it was her brave existence that made them uncomfortable. She didn't apologize for going first class. She just regretted not having gone there sooner. Sitting within these harsh walls, Samantha did not scream, did not rebel. Instead, she let the silence permeate her every thought, every breath, every silent vow, that she would not let this be buried in oblivion. She would not let her son grow up feeling that his mother was handcuffed for daring to dream of good things. Today's humiliation would not be the end, but the first chapter of something bigger, deeper, and more just. And in that cold prison cell, a wounded heart did not collapse, but quietly redrawn the line between silence and voice, between fear and courage. The morning sunlight streaming through the glass windows of the federal courthouse was a reminder that the truth, no matter how buried, will always come out one day. Samantha walked in, no longer the woman who had been handcuffed at the airport that day, but a citizen with a heart filled with the desire to restore dignity, not just for herself, but for all those who had suffered in silence. The pale pink blazer she wore was not to impress, but to remind herself that gentleness and determination are not mutually exclusive. In her hands, she held a thick file, containing not only evidence, but also months of fighting with lawyers who rejected her case for lack of a chance of winning, with human rights organizations who spoke up only when things had become too loud. She had not come to seek revenge. Samantha had never believed in justice as a tool of punishment. She believed in it as a process of healing, where truth was given its rightful place, and pain acknowledged rather than denied. The words her lawyer delivered in court were not harsh, nor did they ring out, but each one was like a deep-seated wound to the heart, about a woman who was treated like a criminal simply because she had bought a first-class ticket with her own sweat and courage, about a society so indifferent to everyday injustices that they became invisible. Across the courtroom, Ava Hart was no longer the charming, smiling, cold-eyed flight attendant. She sat there, gripping her chair, her face pale as the internal recordings were played, revealing that she was the first to suspect that a black passenger could be seated in first class without forging a ticket. Each of her excuses, that it was procedure, that she was just acting on her gut, only served to expose the unconscious bias she was afraid to acknowledge. But worse than Ava was Officer Blake, the man who had claimed he was just doing his job. Airport video showed him walking up without questioning, without listening, and handcuffing Samantha as if she were no longer human. He was not present at the hearing. He had been transferred, facing an internal investigation, but the echoes of his actions echoed in the eyes of those in attendance. In a far corner of the courtroom, Officer Miller sat silently. The memories of that day did not leave him. The hesitation when his teammates acted too quickly, the hesitation when Samantha protested, all of them now came back like cuts to his conscience. He had not done it, but he had not said anything. And in the moment, Samantha had glanced at him, not a word of reproach, just a quiet and unyielding gaze. Officer Miller understood. Silence is never harmless. It is a catalyst for injustice, complicity in the guise of safety. The trial did not end with applause. It ended in solemn silence, as the judge declared that human rights are not the privilege of any particular skin color, and that no individual, be they a public servant or a police officer, has the right to steal another person's dignity simply because they don't look right. Samantha walked out of the courtroom not smiling in triumph, but letting out a long sigh, as if she had finally been given her own. She didn't turn her pain into a spear to stab someone else, but into a foundation to build something more solid. A life where her son wouldn't have to bow his head when asked, "What does your mother do?" And if anyone asked, Samantha would say, "My mother was handcuffed for daring to dream." But she also walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, because no one can chain a soul that knows its worth. And from that moment on, she was more than just a woman of color walking into first class. She was the voice of those who had been silenced for too long. The courtroom was deathly silent as the verdict was read, not because justice was unexpected, but because it was too late. It took the jury just a few hours to reach its verdict. Officer Blake and Ava Hart were both convicted of unlawful restraint, abuse of power, and causing grievous bodily harm. The evidence presented was nearly unassailable. Airport security camera footage, conflicting eyewitness testimony, and the calm but powerful testimony of Samantha Reed herself. The federal judge who presided over the case, known for his fairness and rigor, could not hide his disappointment in his sentencing. He denounced the dangers of professional racism, the betrayal of public trust, and the far-reaching damage done to society when implicit biases are not confronted and eliminated. Given the gravity of the case, an American citizen arrested in public without just cause and then misled by those in power, the court sentenced Officer Blake to 5 years in federal prison. The sentence was not just a personal punishment, but also a warning. Uniforms cannot be a shield for abuse of power. As for Ava Hart, who is not a law enforcement officer but is not innocent, the incident stemmed from her own prejudiced view of a woman of color in first class. Her deliberate exaggeration and fabrication that led to the tragedy resulted in her being sentenced to 2 years of mandatory probation, mandatory racial bias training, and a permanent ban from working in the airline industry. But justice does not stop there. The U.S. Department of Transportation launched a full-scale investigation into how the airline handled discrimination complaints. Internal policies were reviewed and procedures were changed. The public backlash was widespread. Boycotts erupted, shareholders were grilled by advocacy groups, and executives were finally forced to confront the fact that silence was complicity. Officer Miller, who had hesitated but stood by as his fellow officers handcuffed Samantha, was not indicted, but he was not forgiven. His name was written into the investigative file, his silence an indelible stain on the case file. He remained in the force, but from that moment on, his conscience was no longer his. Sometimes the heaviest punishment is not the years behind bars, but the silent gnawing at oneself. And Samantha Reed, she walked out of that courtroom, not victorious, but vindicated. She never wanted to be a symbol. She just wanted to fly, to go home, to be treated like any other passenger. But when the world tried to push her out with prejudice, she didn't choose to be silent or to back down. She chose to stand up, and with that determination, she paved the way for others. Her story is not about revenge, it's about restoring dignity. With the compensation she received, Samantha didn't disappear from the spotlight. She used it to create a legal aid fund for passengers who have been discriminated against in public spaces. Her voice, once silenced by the sound of handcuffs, now rings out at conferences, college lecture halls, and congressional hearings. And while the experience left her scarred, it also shaped her into a quiet but unyielding warrior. To this day, she still remembers the look on her son's face as she was dragged away. The look of bewilderment, fear, helplessness. And that's why every word she says today is not just for herself, but for that boy, and for every child who will one day walk into a classroom, board a plane, or apply for a job, only to find that the color of their skin or their name is something that others will be wary of. In the end, Samantha's persistence became a real verdict. One that echoed far beyond the sound of the court's gavel. That justice, however late, can always come. And that those who use prejudice and power to hurt others will at some point face the consequences, not just from the law, but from a society that is slowly waking up. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If it makes you think, please share it. Because stories like Samantha's don't just end in court. They start conversations, shake up silences, and remind us that dignity isn't something we're given. It's something we have to stand up for and earn. And tomorrow, we'll bring you another story, one that deserves to be heard.